Hello, in this versus video, we are going to put dry versus wet code. Let's get to it. So with dry and wet code, it's actually not a tool that we use within the programming language. It's actually an idea that we have for best practices. And what I mean by best practices is that it's things that you should do to have your code as efficiently and work well as much as possible. And depending on if you are writing your code, if it's dry or wet, that really is a determining factor of how you are programming. And that really cuts down the cost of execution, or it can cut down the cost of how many files and lines of code that you need. So this is a big determining factor for you to be successful as a developer. So let's actually go into what dry and wet mean. And this isn't the typical dry as in bone dry or wet as in like soaking wet. These are actually acronyms that stand for something within the coding language. Dry stands for do not repeat yourself or don't repeat yourself. And what we mean by this is that if you have code that you are repeating yourself over and over again, like if you have a couple lines of code or a single line code that you're just copying and pasting in other areas, or if you're using that over and over again, that isn't as efficient as possible. We want to avoid that as much as possible, and we don't want to repeat ourselves. And there's ways to do that. There's ways to be dry as putting things into modules, or if you are cleaning up your code or calling it once, things like that can help really make your code dry. And we do want to make our code as dry as possible. Now, the opposite of dry is wet. And if you have wet code, it's something that you write every single time. And this isn't as efficient at all because you are repeating yourself. Your file size will grow every time you repeat yourself. The complexity of how you are running your execution of code could grow as well because you're repeating yourself. So I would rarely do wet code at all just because it's not as efficient as dry code, and it's very bad practice to have. I think what you would do just starting off is you would try to have your code work, and that might include having wet code here and there, and that's totally fine. And having wet code isn't bad at first. Just when you go back and refactor, when you go ahead and go back and clean up your code a bit, it's actually better for you to dry things up a bit. And that should be your final product, is to have your dry code. But when you're just starting off, or when you're just building up an app and there's some wet code in there, until later on where you're at a point where you can clean everything up and make things more dry. And this is what the main topic is how can you make your code dry? And also we need to make our code dry at the end of the day, just because that is the best practice for us to have, and it will have a lot less headaches when we are developing. So there's multiple ways you can make things dry. One of the things I already talked about already is putting things into modules. And we'll talk about modules in this video right here. But just to sum up modules, they are just a library of code for you to share or reuse. So if you are reusing code or sharing code within multiple files, as well as other places within the same file that you're repeating yourself, then I would actually break that up into a module and then use the module instead of copying and pasting that code over and over again. And the thing about the dry methodology is that you only need to write it once and then reference that as many times as you need. And that is the better way of doing things, is just writing it once. If you're writing it multiple times, that means you're not being dry at all. And these are mostly for items that are being shared as well as being reused. There's some items within the programming language can't be dry at all, such as if you're defining methods or functions or variables. Those are pretty much set in stone. You have to do those over and over again just because that's just how the language works. But the way that the logic is run, or the way that you're writing your programs, those are the stuff that needs to be dry. That means that when you are repeating yourself within your logic, you need to clean it up by putting it in a module, or only write it once and then reference it later, or using other tools to help make your code more dry. So those are the items that you would make dry. Is mostly logic or the items that you see over and over again. And typically not like what you would usually use within the language that's part of the language that you need to do anyways, like creating a function or creating a variable. Those can't be dry, they're just part of the language. So might as well get used to them, but also dry up your code in the same time. So here, let's go ahead and talk about bad example. More importantly, this is what wet code is that here I have within the Ruby language, I'm printing out this menu of welcome, choose 1 or 2 to start. And I'm also doing the same thing here of print welcome, choose 1 or 2 to start. And judging from this, if I have an option 2 method, I would probably have to put the same line of code in that method as well. And I might have to copy and paste it inside of there or type it in again. And that's kind of annoying because I don't want to print this out again or type it again. It's too long, and also it's not as efficient as it could be. So this is really a bad example. And so at this point in time, it is considered wet code, but it does technically work. And if you're at a good point for you to refactor and clean things up, then what you would do is that at this point in time, you would make things more dry. So one of the ways to combat wet code is to put things into a module. And here we have a module of message, not MSG, is just abbreviation for message. And I have the common code within this method here. That way, I am only defining it once, and then I can reuse this reference as many times as I need to. And I don't have to type this in over and over again, which is awesome. So then how I can use that is, since this is a module, I need to include it within my project. And then I can use that method over and over again. And that looks a lot more dry than what it was. I'm not printing out that message over and over again. I'm just calling the method here. And you might argue that technically I'm just still being wet here by saying menu over and over again. But I'd rather say menu than say print welcome, choose 1 or 2 to start. So you actually are drying up your code, even though you are repeating yourself here and there. But we actually want to limit yourself repeating as much as possible. So that pretty much sums up what dry versus wet code is. Again, we do want to be in the dry methodology of having our code be as clear cut as possible, and we're not repeating ourselves over and over again. And we can use and reuse and share our code in other areas by using tools such as modules or using methods or defining them as variables, things like that. And the key thing about this is you should only write it once instead of writing it multiple times. And then you can reference that over and over again as much as you need and use that reference. And be sure that you always have your code dry instead of wet. That is pretty much it for this video. If you have any questions, be sure to comment down below, and I will see you in the next video. See ya!